Hey, Red. We're not gonna get away with this, are we?
Transistor was made by the people responsible for Bastion, and it shows immediately. The beautiful visual style makes every location look like a masterpiece painting. Darren Korb nails the soundtrack, a voice narrates the events in a similar manner to Bastion, the isometric camera, and so on and so forth. So what if this time the world is less fantasy with guns and more sci-fi? And so what if the combat story ratio has been shifted pretty significantly? Wait, what? Okay, let's slow down for a second. Transistor takes place in a stunning futuristic world where our protagonist, called Red, carries a giant sword, the Transistor, who acts as a narrator for the story. The plot is fairly cryptic, the game avoids exposition at all costs and instead just throws you into the events as soon and as powerfully as possible, but we'll get to that later. Let's first talk in depth about the combat. I'll probably sound like a manual for a few seconds, but bear with me. I really want for everyone to understand the genius of Transistor's combat mechanics, and that will take some explaining. So, as the game progresses, Red gains abilities called functions. A function can be used in 3 different ways. It can be mapped to one of 4 face buttons on the controller, making it act just like an attack. But it may also become a passive skill for Red or a passive enhancement for one of already mapped abilities. Now, functions don't do the exact same thing in all of these slots, obviously, but instead they have a certain theme to themselves. For example, the basic crash function is a short-ranged damage-dealing stunning attack, which usually gives other attacks the ability to stun, but as a passive it makes Red take less damage and become invulnerable to slowing effects. By the end of the game, the players have something like 16 functions at their disposal, which gives almost countless different combinations and builds. What limits the power of builds, however, is both a set number of slots and mem or memory that each function requires, as Red only has so much to spare of either of these. This system means that you'll probably spend a lot of time just on the function select screen alone, trying to choose abilities in a way that matches your playstyle best, but that's just the real-time part of the combat. Very quickly, the player gets introduced to another mechanic called turn. Pressing right trigger on the controller essentially freezes time and allows Red to plan ahead her moves and attacks, then execute all of them almost at once. The disadvantage is that after using turn, it has to recharge, which takes about 7-ish seconds, and while turn recharges, Red cannot attack with any of her functions and is forced to essentially dance between enemies and their projectiles. This opens up so many different combat possibilities and scenarios to think of. Should I use turn to dunk all my damage at a single strong foe, or use it to eliminate weaker enemies first? Maybe I should get a faster ability to kill weaklings in real time and a more powerful one to destroy stronger opponents during turn. Or maybe using turn is just dumb as it leaves me too open and I should just do everything in real time. Or maybe I should only use it to move around the battlefield instead of attacking anything. In addition to that, there are quite a few types of enemies to tackle, and each gets an enhanced version as the game progresses, making for diverse and challenging arenas. The interesting thing is, just killing an enemy by lowering his health to 0 is usually not enough. Red also has to pick up a cell that a killed foe leaves behind, otherwise they essentially come back to life. And if that's not difficult enough, worry not. Bastion's idols make a return, this time under the name limiters. They unlock as the player progresses through the game, and it's the player who chooses how many or how few of them are active at once. Now, using them makes combat more challenging, for example by limiting your available mem or making opponents drop false cells which deal damage upon picking up, but they also raise the amount of experience gained after each fight. Frankly, I feel like idols and limiters are some of the least appreciated and most fun mechanics that Supergiant Games came up with. They gradually make your experience more and more challenging as well as more and more rewarding, but the player may always choose to reduce the difficulty level almost on the fly. It's quite genius, to be honest. Oh, and to make everything even more interesting, death in Transistor isn't just quote-unquote death. When Red loses all of her health points, one of her active functions is destroyed, and she may no longer use it in the current arena, as well as a few subsequent ones. This mechanic is one of the most clever ideas in the game, as it forces players out of their comfort zones, the set build of abilities, and makes them try different functions to substitute for the ones they lost. Now, if all of this sounds complicated, maybe even overly so, I still urge you to try Transistor for yourself. The mixture of turn-based combat and complicated ability system was what kept me from playing this game for almost 3 years since it launched. It just seemed like it requires too much tactical thinking, too much planning ahead, while me, well, I'm a real-time combat guy. I prefer action and slashing. Surprisingly, I found Transistor's combat not only deep, but incredibly satisfying. Just creating your build, spending a few minutes on the function select screen, is a joy on its own. And the best thing is, with all of these gimmicks and iterations, Transistor still feels somewhat simple and intuitive. You do, after all, just press a button to attack. The combat is genius, and frankly, those are some of the best fighting mechanics I've seen in a video game for a long time, possibly ever. And then you add the absolutely beautiful hand-drawn graphics, gorgeous explosions and particle effects, and, of course, the music. Darren Korb once again created a masterful soundtrack, which I highly recommend getting with the game should you choose to buy it. I wasn't sure he'd be able to recreate the success of Bastion music, but Transistor's OST, it shines, both the regular version and the extended one with Red's extra vocal layer. Where Transistor falls flat, however, is pretty much in everything else. Let's start with the biggest gameplay downside, which is anything that's not combat. Outside of that stellar fighting experience, the only thing the players may do is walk around, and walk fairly slowly, mind you, to explore, which might uncover some terminals with extra story-related data or possibly trigger enemy spawning, but that's it. There are no secrets, no currency to gain, as the only progression happens through gathering experience points and leveling up. There are no breakable objects, pretty much no one to talk to. Only a few spots where a prompt asks to press A so that the Transistor can say a few words. This is a giant flaw in the game's design, but surprisingly, not a deal breaker. What almost broke the deal for me though, but still not quite, is the story. Bastion had an excellent, simple story with good characters and, frankly, a lot of emotions right at the end. Transistor's story is a bit more convoluted, which is fine, but also a lot more cryptic. I don't think there's a single bit of exposition in the entire script, maybe save for a few locations close to the end, and that barely explains anything. The players are just thrown into this world and have only Transistor's comments helping them understand what is actually happening to the world, to Red, to the Transistor itself. And because the sword isn't as much a narrator as just a character in the world of the game, his talking doesn't really explain a lot. See, all of this would be fine in a game like Dark Souls, because A, Dark Souls' cryptic storytelling both makes its world seem more dark and hides the fact that its lore is just a dump of cliches and tropes, and B, Dark Souls' gameplay is so polished on every level that you just don't care that much. But in Transistor, anything that isn't combat is so scarce and serves pretty much only to hint at something in the lore that you lose interest both in walking around and in the lore. That doesn't mean the story is bad, don't get me wrong. In fact, its ending is fairly strong and subsequent playthroughs help you make more sense of it. And the game has loads of replayability, which is awesome. I just wish it was less cryptic and helped you stay engaged instead of making you fight with it to understand it. Let's not end on a sad note though. My absolutely favorite thing about Transistor have to be challenge rooms, accessible at certain points in the game. Now, some of them have the player kill everything in one turn, other ones require surviving for a certain amount of time. My favorite type were definitely the ones where you start with limited number of functions and mem and must fight off waves of increasingly stronger enemies, but each finished wave unlocks more functions and mem. The great thing about these rooms is the same as about Dying in Transistor. They focus on the combat experience, force the player to experiment with functions, and put a subtle spin on all the mechanics, keeping them fresh. So, Transistor. I think a lot of people might have overlooked this game, hearing unfavorable comparisons to Bastion, and I also think that it's a huge shame. Not everything works here as well as I wish it did. If the story was less cryptic, and if there was something to do outside of combat, I think the game would be a masterpiece. Still, I have to repeat myself and say that neither of these is a deal breaker. Because of the combat that feels at the same time so familiar, yet so fresh, interesting and deep. Because of the amazing art style and magnificent soundtrack. Because of the atmosphere, I find it impossible not to recommend Transistor. But primarily because of the combat.